And now that brings me to the talk by tonight's speaker, Professor Justin O'Rian. And I would like to do a very brief introduction to Justin, which does not in any way do justice to him and his incredible contribution to his field by way of academic research, its application, and real-life conservation challenges and the development of supportive policy. So, yeah. So a brief introduction. Professor Justin O'Rian is a behavioural ecologist with a special interest in understanding and addressing conservation conflicts in Southern Africa. He obtained his PhD at UCT in 1996 on the evolution of sociality in naked mole rats, and followed this with a postdoc on meerkats with the Universities of Cambridge and Paris. He is a recipient of the prestigious NRF President's Award, UCT Young Fellows Award, and the UCT's Distinguished Teacher Award. I can definitely say that Justin is a fantastic teacher. He taught me a long, long time ago. Thanks, Justin. Justin is an academic advisor to 3 NGOs, Panthera, Cape Leopard Trust, and Save Our Seas Foundation. And he currently leads projects funded by Forestry South Africa, WWF South Africa, and the National Research Foundation. And he is director of IC Wild, committed to producing research of a very high standard and communicating this with key audiences to inform policy and practice. IC Wild is the Institute for Communities and Wildlife in Africa, and it is an inter- and transdisciplinary intellectual community dedicated to mitigating human-wildlife conflict, improving human well-being, and protecting biodiversity in Africa. Within the fields of behavioural ecology and conservation biology, Justin continues his long-term work on the causes of sociality in mammals, which include a strong research emphasis on the importance of behavioural studies in deriving sustainable solutions to mammal species in conflict with humans in Southern Africa. He is consultant to the City of Cape Town, Cape Nature, and Sandparks on baboon management. And with that, Justin, it's over to you.
Thank you, Kirsten. It's a pleasure to be talking to this very diverse audience. And right at the outset, I'd just like to stress that I pitched this more for the general, the public. We've got a lot of academic papers that support this, and you're welcome to contact me if you have a particular interest in any of the research angles. So I'm going to be talking about a particular conservation conflict, and that's between, humans and baboons on the Cape Peninsula. But I think it's relevant globally. I think it's relevant to the management of wildlife species in peri-urban spaces throughout the world. And I'm of the opinion that if you manage to manage baboons, if you manage to come up with a sustainable solution for baboons, then you can pretty much do it for any other species, because there are very few as challenging as this species. And with that, I'd also like to just mention that of all the wildlife species that I've encountered, this one is the one which you had to take your hat off to and say, what a remarkable suite of adaptations. To persist and to even thrive in some instances in human-modified and human-dominated landscapes is testimony to their remarkable skills. So as a wild animal, they're an impressive combination of skill, dexterity, sociality. And that makes them really challenging to manage. But I believe that Cape Town was getting it right. I'm going to make the case. I'm going to show you how I think Cape Town was getting it right and how we stumbled and how we are now uncertain, and how it seems to me that what was one of the best wildlife management on the Urban Edge programs is in a pickle, and how we can perhaps unravel that. Okay, just to put you in perspective, this around the world, top left, we've got boar throughout Europe. We've got fox, we've got coyote in the United States, we've got raccoons. You've got a whole range of medium-sized generalist species that seem to persist and even thrive in urban areas. And of course, let's not forget fantastic Mr. Fox, one of the most adept species at managing urban landscapes, at finding a way to persist at higher densities in urban areas than they do in natural. In South Africa, In Southern Africa and Africa, we've got far larger species. We've got far bigger challenges, in my opinion. We've got elephants walking straight out of Kruger National Park. We've got large predators that can eat humans and eat our livestock. And so these challenges are far more serious because it's not so much of a nuisance as it is often a threat to lives and livelihoods. And that, of course, increases the ante. Now, that's not to say that the rest of the world doesn't have these. On the top left there, we had that rather famous walrus in Norway, Freya the walrus, that was actually put down in the end because people were getting too close to her and she was doing a lot of damage to boats. A very interesting case study in Italy where this bear, and she's pictured here with her top right with her cubs, she actually killed runners running in the forests, and yet when there was a suggestion by the authorities that behavior was perhaps had gone too far and that she should be put down, a court case was mounted, and the court case went in favor of her, and she now lives in a sanctuary. So she was taken off death row, as they put it, and now lives in a sanctuary. And this primate at the bottom here wasn't as lucky. It's an unfortunate term to equate it with gangs. That's very much a human thing. But yeah, executed. And these sort of conflicts, the conflict really is between the people on how to mitigate negative impacts between wildlife and people. So when we talk about conservation conflicts, it's really what we're talking about. And when we talk about people, we've got to be mindful of the incredible diversity. And this is what makes conservation conflicts so difficult. It's why some people say I'm crazy to even be in this field. And it's why many of my colleagues drop out of this field, retire early, burn out, because it is difficult. You're dealing with people, and we're not really trained as biologists to deal with people. And that's why we need to have an interdisciplinary institute, because we're dealing with values, we're dealing with different modes of media communication, different legal structures. And so if we look at conservation conflicts, which is in the center here, we have to understand what's causing them, what's causing this wild animal or to have negative impacts, or people on wild animals. And then we need to think about mitigation and solutions. And the key thing about conservation conflicts is you never actually solve them. They're there forever. It typically talks to a broken system at some level. And the planet at many levels is breaking. We're exceeding planetary boundaries. And so we're stuck with managing so many wildlife systems. And it's never perfect. And because it's not perfect, you open yourself up to criticism. And you're going to need multiple stakeholders. So in this simplistic, we've got government, it's a simplistic overview. We've got government, organizations, professionals, NGOs, and in the blue here, the academia. And just to show you how complicated it can be, these are all the groups that I work with in trying to understand local conservation conflicts. And my colleagues throughout the university, this is why we had to set up an interdisciplinary institute, because we need the economics. We've got to understand the costs and the benefits. We need to understand the history of our relationship with this animal, how it happened, how did we get here, the philosophy, what values, what ethics are relevant to this. The politics is pervasive. It's always relevant. And the arts, because art is one of the best ways of changing long-held perceptions, either on each other or on wildlife. So that's what we're trying to do in our institute, and it's extraordinarily difficult. And just to give you a local context, we work on white sharks here. We work on which is a local apex predator. We work on the baboons, obviously. This is the peninsula here on the bottom of the screen. So on the peninsula, we've lost our apex terrestrial predator, the leopard, which is still present in nearby Stellenbosch, the mountains behind that. And of course, on the Cape Flats, we've lost almost all our wildlife, because flat land is what we build and farm on. And there's an endemic mammal sitting right here in Cape Town, the Cape Dune mole rat, and it doesn't have a champion. And it has very little research done it. I think we're the only ones in University of Pretoria to have worked on it. And it's unfortunate, because our priorities aren't really aligned with the conservation status of particular species. But as I said, this is really an opportunity to understand people and wildlife, and understand how urban populations are changing the way they think about their relationship with wildlife. Now, it doesn't get more difficult than large white sharks coming into areas that we like to play in. And when humans are on the menu, we tend to have irrational thoughts and irrational fears. And If we have a look at some data that one of my students collected in terms of how many sharks we see swimming past beaches, we see that in summer it peaks and in winter it troughs. And if we look at people, it's the same pattern. Obviously, we like to go to the beach when it's warm. But this presents a problem because you have a large apex predator, which is slightly opportunistic, overlapping with easy to catch people out of their niche or their comfort zone because they're in the water. And so we needed to understand, how come there are so many white sharks in False Bay? And a lot of research has been done by many students, some of my students, to understand that white sharks are coming into False Bay during winter to catch fat-laden seals on their first naive swims out into False Bay, make for very easy catching. And this breaching behavior, which is rather unique, is all linked to the unique bathymetry around the island and these fat-laden little seals leaving at the wrong time or coming back at the wrong time, and so making themselves an easy target for a counter-shaded large predator like a white shark. And in the summer, the seals have wised up. They're very difficult to catch, and you get large shoals of nice oily fish, yellowtail, swimming along the inshore from sort of Cape Point round past Simonstown and on to Muizenberg. And the sharks and many other predators are following that. And of course, that's unfortunately when they come into contact with humans. We're not really on the menu. They're not looking for us, but there's a slight element of opportunism. And because we've got mountains next to the ocean, what a great opportunity to spot them when they're swimming by, and in deference to them. And I really like this. Get out the water. There's a white shark coming past. It's not looking for us. It's looking for other things. So up goes the white flag, and a siren goes, whistles go, and people are told to get out the water. Unfortunately, despite that, some people persist in swimming in the water with large sharks. And when an individual got bitten by a large shark, there was an uproar. The people whose livelihoods depend on people being in the water, surf shops, surf trading, life-saving, complained again to the city of Cape Town saying something's got to be done about these sharks. And I disagree. I think that if you put the white flag up and someone goes into the water, that's pretty much their fault. The pressure is always on the authorities. And so they put up this barrier net. And so you can now swim at that beach, Fishhook Beach, where there'd been a couple of attacks. This barrier prevents the sharks from coming in. So you have an option, and you can see it's being used. The people are all pretty much on the one side. Unfortunately, in KwaZulu-Natal, they use a different kind of net. Very few people, in fact, we've done surveys on this, up to 90% of respondents don't realize that shark nets in KwaZulu-Natal on the east coast of this country are designed explicitly to kill large sharks. So they are gill nets, they are fishing devices. And they were pioneered in Australia, in Sydney actually. And the idea was to show that you actually, by using these gill nets, you're going to reduce the number of sharks. And the idea is simply this: if there are fewer sharks, the probability of an incident becomes lower. So I want you to draw your attention to the last line here. This is the catch per unit effort. So how many sharks do you catch for the amount of time your net's in the water? And you can see a precipitous decline in the number of large sharks captured over time. And that suggests that this really did have a very strong negative impact on the population. And I don't know how many of you are following the story. The scientists are slightly disagreeing with one another about what the main causes of the decline of white sharks. It's almost certainly a whole range of issues, but it's fascinating that here in the Western Cape, the arrival of a top predator, the return of a top predator that was geared towards or specializing in eating sharks, the orca or killer whale, has seen or resulted in a rapid, almost overnight disappearance of white sharks from False Bay. So if you like using the water, the shark spotters are up there. They're not seeing white sharks. Cape Town's been extraordinarily safe from a white shark bite perspective for a long time now. And it's just a strong message about the importance of top predators and ecosystems. I'm sure many of you have heard about wolves in Yellowstone, how they can shape the behavior through a landscape of fear of other predators. And they can do what we can never do. And that is, they can instill or change the behavior of an entire suite of predators. They can shift them out of an area. Now, it's not the only reason why we have declined white sharks, but we had acoustically tagged sharks in False Bay when these orcas came and started their behavior, and our acoustic receivers went quiet overnight. So it's very strong evidence that the orcas do have a remarkable short-term impact. And now we're stuck with, well, what is the long-term story? Have we got a genuine decline in these white sharks? And unfortunately, as I said, when the scientists are arguing, the policymakers are not sure what to do. So we need to try and resolve this. And the only way we're going to get there is with more data, but working in the ocean is extremely difficult. On land, we know our predators, we know our systems a lot better because we are of the land, and we know that in the Cape Peninsula we lost our apex predators. So we've got a system without predators shaping the landscape of fear for baboons, and that's very important because it allows the baboons to do difficult things. And we also know that we humans have massively altered the landscape. So here's a picture of vineyards, and you can see wherever there's low-lying land, we've taken it for crops. In the background here, we've got the wheat fields. So wheat, any low-lying land was taken for agriculture, wheat. And thank goodness we've got mountains, because this is an aerial shot of Holland. And yeah, there's not a lot of biodiversity left there. So our mountains became important refuges in the Western Cape for wildlife. And as you can see here, this is an aerial shot of Cape Town, and there's the Cape Peninsula, the study area for today's talk, stretching down into the south there. Wherever it's low-lying, we've taken it. We've got agriculture out on the edges here, and we've got dense urban areas lapping up against the high-lying land. And so Table Mountain National Park is as a result of, we couldn't farm it. We couldn't put our city there. If it had been flat, it was gone. There would be no national park here whatsoever. That's a simple fact. But now we've got one, which means we've got wildlife in close proximity to a city. And that's very important for laying the stage for long-term conservation conflicts. And this is what it looks like from a land use perspective. The light green is sort of optimal land. The high points here, the top of the mountains, not good for many animals other than Himalayan tars and klip springers, Himalayan tars being exotic. So, you know, the lime green color is what would have been really good for most animals, including baboons. And 55% of that's been taken. So this is where we've built our houses, schools, shopping centers, roads, and down south here, we've still got large parts of it, but this used to be a farm. You can be guaranteed we haven't gone there because it's just very difficult to live there. It's highly exposed, huge winds. That's our history. So the baboons, as many other species, got stuck between a rock, Table Mountain, and a hard place, which is the urban area. And life's been difficult. But being adaptable, being opportunistic, they soon learned that we are a pretty good source of food. We bring food up into the mountains for them. And so the baboons have given a choice between foraging on fynbos, and this is what we'd like to see, or coming down into urban areas, not just for waste and not just for backpacks, but for the fact that rivers are at low altitude. The soils are deeper, the plants are more productive. So exotic plants and fynbos, all more productive at low-lying altitudes. So baboons are wired to go low. They want to forage low and sleep high. And so there is a goal, a stated goal of a sustainable population with improved welfare and conservation, but that's quite a challenge. That's quite a challenge in the setting that I've just provided. And, you know, baboons are scary to many people. And, you know, these canines are longer than a lion's. They're not as thick as a lion's, but they're remarkably adept at using them on each other. Remarkably, they don't use them on people much. There've been, I think, a single accident with a child where I think the canines have done some damage, but baboons are not out to harm people. They are literally armed to the teeth, but they don't tend to use that on us. They do use them on dogs, and you can see here a dog with double canine slash. That's what they typically do. The canines go in and then they pull backwards, and the trailing edge of the canine of a baboon is like a knife blade. And so during the period when I first got involved with baboons, 2000 to 2008, there was a baboon management team. It was stakeholder inclusive. Members of the public were allowed to attend meetings and have their opinion, but it was largely reactive and paralyzed because they didn't have clear structure or guidelines for, you know, what to do with all the all the incredibly diverse events that happen on a day-to-day basis with the baboon coming into an urban space. So management was largely ad hoc. There were no clear protocols, no standard operating procedures to guide day-to-day management. And probably worst of all, funding was erratic and low. Now, any conservation or wildlife management without good funding, predictable funding, is going to be poor. And so the people who were managing at the time were seriously hamstrung by that. And the statistics here really tell the story. You know, baboons were in urban areas 30% of the time. 53% of all deaths that baboons suffered from were as a result of retaliatory killing in urban areas. And the population numbers, although low, were just starting to increase, but the population was still at risk of some extinction event. And this is what it looked like. Baboons sleeping inside apartment blocks. This is Navy land. Coming out, they've spent the night in there, now they're going to go and forage in the fynbos. But on the way, they can pick up waste food. And, you know, this picture is there to remind you of the other species that I showed you. Which species has that level of dexterity? You know, not a coyote, not a raccoon. Raccoons are close, but they don't have the power. Not a fox, not a boar, not a dingo in Australia. You know, this is a rather extraordinary species. And they are capable of remarkable feats, opening car doors. And so people have to baboon-proof, and many people don't like their houses looking like that, but, you know, so they leave them like that, and then the baboons are going to use their space. And it can be fun. It can be entertaining. Baboons are very entertaining to watch in an urban. But if they get in, it's a mess. It can be extraordinarily messy. And baboons carry pathogens. They picked up pathogens from us. We don't want baboons eating our food. We don't want baboons in our space, sharing pathogens, sharing parasites. It's not good. And of course, baboons pay the ultimate price. You know, one of the first baboons that was ever x-rayed was a baboon called Fred. This is Fred's x-ray. He had over 70 pieces of metal in him. So this is the signature of the welfare compromise, I believe, that this baboon suffered through his life. I don't think of this as a good quality of life. I think this animal must have suffered a lot. And those pellets are testimony to that. So how do you stop this? How do you arrest all that negative interaction that coming into urban space and the baboons paying the price? Well, you're going to have to keep the baboons out of the urban areas, because urban areas are clearly bad for people if baboons come in, and they're bad for baboons. So a lose-lose scenario. And one of the first things we did was, well, how are baboons using the space? Is there enough space for them? Is there enough food for them? And this was such a worrying figure. In this yellow polygon, this is Hart Bay, by the way. This is Constantia to Kai. Those of you out of country, I think what you need to understand is that we've got a plantation here in dark green, and we've got vineyards with grapes in light green. And inside this yellow polygon, this land here is natural vegetation. It's the national park. It's the land set aside for wildlife. And these dots are GPS collar data from 3 troops. And as you can see, these GPS data are in the urban space. This is all city of Cape Town. They're in the plantation, and they're in the vineyards. There's not one GPS point in the national park. So we are up against it. And when we got this data, we quickly went to the authorities and said, look, you're in trouble. You're going to have to find a way to get the baboons to move back into the park. And we expanded this. We put collars on troops throughout the peninsula with the goal of actually putting the baboons on the map so that developers would be impacted by where the home ranges of baboons were. It would automatically trigger the city of Cape Town to say, hold on, you want to put up a new eco estate, but do you realize that's the home range of a baboon? So that was the idea. And you can see that the baboons are not everywhere on the peninsula. In fact, anywhere that there's high-lying land, there are no baboons. And that speaks to the fact that baboons like these low-lying lands, which we tend to like too. So it's only when you have places like Cape Point where you see the baboons using large sections of the low-lying land, because we haven't built there. So through a very long and difficult process of engaging with the NSPCA and NSPCA to look after the welfare of animals. So tools like paintball markers. Now, some people find this really offensive. You know, the idea of using a paintball gun on a baboon. They would consider that to be contrary to the welfare of the animals. But if you know that the welfare of the animals is what I showed you, where you get shot on a regular basis with actual guns, I'm going to ask you whether you consider this to be a better option. And in fact, we asked the NSPCA, and the NSPCA looked at the data and said, goodness me, baboons are dying the most terrible and being injured in the most terrible way in urban areas. Dogs, cars, electrocutions, people with guns. We would rather that baboons were kept out using a tool like this, where the objective is not to shoot the baboons, but to warn the baboons that you can shoot them. That's the first prize. And only if they persist in coming towards you, you could then shoot them, but under strict standard operating procedures. And the NSPCA bought into this and held a workshop with key stakeholders. And it was a very important moment, because now you had the people who are mandated to act on the Animal Protection Act for welfare saying they would rather this approach than individuals being going into town and suffering. So it was a landmark moment. There was a lot of objection to it. Despite that, the paintball markers were introduced. And at the same time, the first electric fences came on, and we went through what was called the golden decade, where baboons spent much less time in urban areas. They had improved conservation status because they were part of the ecology. They were eating indigenous vegetation and defecating the seeds out and contributing to seed dispersal. But this success over a 10-year period was never well communicated. And stakeholder engagement waned. What you needed to do is, people were cross about certain aspects of the program, and you needed to sit them down and tell them. So the idea here is that you can come up with great solutions, but you need to keep engaging with your stakeholders, even when you're ahead, even when the game is going well. And so electric fences, this is what a baboon-proof fence looks like. It really does work. It's extraordinarily successful. 12 years. This fence doesn't look very impressive, has kept troops. There hasn't been a troop to come into this area in 12 years. So it's been remarkably successful. It's got access gates so you can go onto the mountain. And we were lucky enough to get a collar, or have a collar on a troop at the time that they were building this first fence. You can see these are the GPS points of the troop, and this is a suburb. And the baboons were sleeping, this cluster of GPS points and this one over here, they're sleeping in the urban area. Levels of conflict between people was extraordinary. The damages to property were extreme. You know, there were horses in this area. It was just a mess. And the fence went up, and that's the line that the fence was going to take, and 100% success after 6 months of our recording that data. And the best thing about it is that the baboons were able to forage right up to the edge of that fence. If you use paintball guns, you typically have to push them a bit further away. You require a bigger buffer area. So fences loomed as a fantastic long-term solution. You still need ranges at the edge over here. You still need ranges at the edge here, but you need 2 ranges versus 10. So you become much more effective. It's good for baboons. It was brilliant for the community. The economics kicks in, property prices improve, time to sell your property improves. This is your major asset. That's a win for the community. And it's a win for the baboons, because they're no longer getting killed for coming into urban spaces. So how are we doing? How's the population doing? This is the good news, but also a challenge. If we have a look at, don't worry about the 3 different colors. It just shows there's 3 subpopulations in Cape Town, North, South, and Cape of Good Hope. And Cape of Good Hope is the sort of most protected area, no development there. And it's fascinating to see that their numbers are kind of just stable, tracking along. No predators there, but yeah, it's tough living in Fynbos, very tough. Those that can access in green here, agricultural areas in the north, they're going up, and so is the south. So we've got a population that's growing. So all the hoo-ha many of you might have heard on social media about Cape Town and terrible for baboons, well, hold on. As a conservation biologist, as a wildlife manager, I say this population is not only stable, but it's growing. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that along the way, some individuals get put down. And so let's have a look at that. Now, there's 2 periods here. I want to look at the 2005 to 2011. This is before paintball markers and electric fences came in, the sort of harsh management, if you like, increasing the costs. Some people called it militaristic. And then let's compare it to more recently, 2012 to 2020, when these, tools were being used and when there were guidelines that had been developed for decision-making and standard operating procedures in place. It was efficient, it was working well, and we can see, if we look at the cause of death, and this is the percentage of, because the population is changing all the time, so we need to express death as a percentage. We start off on the far left here, natural. We see that more baboons started to die of natural causes. And far fewer baboons started dying on the roads, power lines, guns, dogs, poisoning, trauma. So the overall message here, if you sum over the two periods, you've got a remarkable shift in mortality, which is linked to inhumane and suffering causes of death. So if you get attacked by a dog, it's a slow death. If you get shot by a gun, it's a slow death. It's not designed. Versus the authorities were putting baboons down with poor welfare, baboons that were getting through this non-lethal net. And these baboons, they are killed. They are going to die as much as these ones are, but it's a humane death. There's no suffering with that death. So it's sort of, it becomes a question of, well, which approach results in better welfare? And if your argument is a welfare argument, and the SPCA argument is a welfare argument, the SPCA, national, local, puts down probably more animals than any other organization in the city of Cape Town. And they do it because they're trying to prevent suffering. And this is the same argument. So you're going to have to make a choice. You're going to have to go with a system where you allow baboons to come into urban areas and die inhumanely, or you will keep them out as much as you can with non-lethal. And if you can't, there might be a lethal component to your management. So this scenario was not sitting well with some people, and it took one baboon. This is the equivalent of Cecil the lion. This was Kataza the baboon, and it was during lockdown. There was a lot of activity on social media. People had a lot of time. Kataza became symbolic of what people didn't like about how baboons were being managed, this militaristic perspective. But I've just given you the conservation indicators, so we're going to have to juxtapose that with this. There was a legal challenge. Somehow the NSPCA, which had a change in staff, forgot that they'd actually supported the use of paintball markers, and they came out and they said, oh, paintball markers seem to be inhumane and cruel. They retracted that after an initial period, but still the city stopped using paintball markers for a while. And then the city accepted a legal opinion that they actually don't have a mandate to manage baboons. And so they backed off. And now we've got rangers without paintball markers. We've got no guidelines, no standard operating procedures. And just as we predicted, if we have a look at baboons dying in urban areas, we were coming down, and look how it's gone up. So we're now in a situation where baboons are being killed inhumanely in urban areas at unprecedented rates, because the authorities took fright, decided that they weren't going to manage because they're tired of being criticized for being inhumane and cruel, even though all the indicators were positive. Improving population with improved welfare, who wouldn't want that? And a happier community, because they don't have baboon incursions. And so the regression started. Then Dr. Creasy, very recently, she came along and said, what on earth is going on? She was obviously lobbied intensely by many ratepayer groups. She told the Sandpark City and Cape Nature to please work together, that civic, provincial, and national authorities get together. You're all responsible for this. They formed a new group. They engaged with stakeholders. But now we're in this ridiculously difficult situation where the city of Cape Town has said that they're no longer going to be funding a baboon program with rangers to keep baboons out. They want to transition to fences, to have more fences, which is something that we told them to do in 2012. So 12 years of vacillating. So we're in a ridiculous situation where the city of Cape Town, we're going to have nothing. The residents are going to have nothing. The baboons are going to have no one, no costs. They're only going to have benefits from coming into town. And what we know is going to happen, if we go back in history, we know that this means baboons are going to come into town even more. And that means more death. It means more damage to properties. It's a lose-lose scenario. And after the success of that golden decade, we are actually going to go back. And for the first time in the history, since we've been collecting population data, the population has started to decline. So not only are baboons dying inhumanely, the population is going down. And we achieved this how? We achieved this by not following stakeholder-informed guidelines which work, and tools that work. So I'm going to give you a quick summary. This is the only wordy slide I've got, but it's an important history. And I hope that wherever you are in the world, wherever you're facing a wildlife or conservation management challenge, you're aware that these are key issues. These are things that can scupper your program. Okay, so we've got 25 years of developing management plans, adaptive management. That's what we always want. We want to adapt our management, diverse stakeholder input. None of these guidelines, none of the bias in a vacuum. They took scientists, members of the public, welfare organizations, NGOs, and authorities, workshops ad nauseum developing them. But it was only best policy in the world without money means no success. It's only when stable funding was leveraged through city ratepayers that the program really started to get an operational side to complement the great policy. By international standards of wildlife management, it was a success, with improving conservation welfare and health status of baboons and less damage to people, property, and pets. A win-win scenario. But this success was poorly communicated by the authorities. They sat back on their laurels. Stakeholder engagement was also poor. People were upset with the fact that baboons were being killed. Bring them into a workshop. Say to them, look, no one wants to kill a baboon. No one wants to see baboons die in urban space. So what are the alternatives? What do you propose? Let's hear it. Let's give us the costing. Tell us how you're going to solve this. And if you can't, well, you know what? We're going to carry on doing what we know works for baboons and people. And that just didn't happen. There was a sort of a reluctance to engage or debate these key issues, and you cannot do that. You've got to engage with your stakeholders. You've got to see if they can convince you that they have a better alternative. Inevitable disagreements were never addressed. So during lockdown, COVID was amazing from many points of view. We learned so much about people, and we learned the power of social media and people sitting on social media. And we learned the power of an individual. We knew that from Cecil the Lion. We got Kataza the baboon, and they filled the communication void that the authorities had established. And they filled it up with a lot of it was disinformation, a lot of misinformation, a lot of canceling of people, canceling of scientists, canceling of authorities, death threats, vandalism. It was remarkable. It was a mess. The politicians were lobbied, and successfully, on social media. They're vulnerable to media campaigns. They do lack backbone. They responded poorly, making political decisions which weren't good for wildlife. Politicians are not wildlife managers. And they overruled, and they made decisions that were bad for both baboons and communities. City managers, fearing from their jobs, retreated from decision-making. We don't want to make a decision. Paralysis ensued. The city is now, through saying we're not going to have a ranger program, you guys are on your own. Come on, communities, come up with a solution yourself. The most difficult animal, arguably, in the world to manage as a neighbor is now going to be done by communities. Ridiculous. It's great that Barbara Creasy, the environmental minister, forced Sandparks and Cape Nature back into the room, but they don't have operational budget. So it's a real challenge. We know the city has capital budget, operational budget, and knowledge, but all of this got trumped by a legal opinion that they don't have a mandate to manage baboons. But that's a legal opinion. We can debate it. Lawyers can debate it. Lawyers can make more money out of this scenario, but hopefully we don't get there. We just simply want a scenario like this. This is my last slide, and this is a summary of the landscape. What we've got on the top left here is these are the things that attract baboons into urban areas: our gardens, our houses with food, our waste, agricultural products, water, swimming pools. But when they come in, there are people with guns, there are vehicles, electricity, dogs, and poison. It's a dangerous space. We need residents to be informed, proactive, tolerant, and engaged with their authorities. And we need the authorities to be transparent, consultative. They weren't good enough at that. They weren't good enough at communication. They were excellent at transparency. They told everyone everything that they did, All of their decisions were publicized in the media. All of their strategies were available. And we need them to be responsible. We don't need communities managing baboons. We need professional wildlife managers. We need them to be informed, professional. They've got to have permits. They've got to have guidelines. They've got to be accountable to the public. And they need to be permitted to communicate. So these are the people that are the best informed at what they do. And yet the authorities always want to be the ones having the word with the public, and they need to just let go of that and let professionals communicate. Because communication in conservation conflicts, or human wildlife conflict, as some people like to call it, is critical. If you're not communicating and you're not communicating clearly, you will lose the fight. We've got to have researchers, welfare organizations, civics, and NGOs back in the room with the authorities, because currently they're outside the room. We need more fences, and we need NGOs and people who use social media to compromise, provide alternatives, to be non-divisive. We need welfare to be better funded, and we need applied research. And those research findings must be shared. And if we do all of that, we know exactly how it works, and this is applicable to pretty much any conservation conflict in the world. You will get better behaved baboons, wary of humans, natural foraging, healthier, better welfare. And of course, we still need to genetically rescue this population, which has been isolated by a rising tide of humanity. And that really defines the Anthropocene and the challenge that all of us face in living next door or coexisting with wildlife. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you very, very much. It was a beautifully illustrated and beautifully told story. It's very moving, and I just want to thank you very much for sharing your insight on a very challenging topic. I see that we have one question in the chat, and then I'm going to open it up to other people that would like to put their hands up. So CL Vaughan, who's one of our colleagues, asked, what kind of effects do baboon fences have on other wildlife?
Yeah, so other wildlife are stopped, and everything's sort of big enough. The Bonox fencing, I think it's about 15 centimeters. So if you're smaller than that, if you're a grey mongoose, you can get through. But here's the challenge. It'll keep porcupines out. It'll keep caracal out. And we work on caracal. And we know that when caracal come into urban space, they die and they get killed on roads. So the main cause of mortality on the peninsula is vehicle accidents for caracal. So keeping them out of urban areas is good. We know that caracal that go into urban areas get exposed to rodenticides. So we look, if we look at the health of caracal, deeply compromised. They've got heavy metals, they've got rodenticides, they'll be exposed to pesticides. So wildlife coming into urban areas, it feels like a lovely notion, but it's invariably very bad for them. So we think of urban areas or green spaces for many animals as being a wildlife, as an ecological trap. There's food there, but when you come in there, be wary, and they're not wary because these things are insidious and they're hidden. And so the health of the animals is compromised. So we think this is very good for many other wildlife species. And it talks to the fact that we don't have a buffer area between Table Mountain National Park and Cape Town. We've got a very hard edge with, national park straight into residential area. So the fence just emphasizes that urban edge, that sort of hard edge, and stops wildlife from coming into our dangerous spaces.
Thanks, Justin. I see CL's sent in another question. Do you see any issues with inbreeding in the troops that you monitor?
Yeah, so it's very hard to know whether there is inbreeding depression. We know that there's been one genetic study to show that they lack genetic diversity. So it was mitochondrial DNA. They have very few haplotypes. So this really suggests that the peninsula population should be in need of genetic rescue down the line. We have got some troops where individuals have very poor health. They've got mange. Young infants have got mange. We don't know whether they lack genetic diversity. We know there's been a lot of inbreeding in that troop, but we can't prove it yet. The precautionary principle with wildlife or conservation is that when you lack genetic diversity, you should try and improve it. So we want to bring baboons onto the peninsula, but not until we've got better fencing so that those baboons don't get corrupted and end up in urban spaces.
Thank you, Justin. I see Emlyn has got his hand up. Emlyn, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, thank you very much, Kirsten. One comment or question on that wonderful presentation that was so informative. I'm recalling a compelling example given at the Jackson Hole Wildlife Film Festival about a decade ago, after wolves were controversially reintroduced into Yellowstone, as I understood it. I'm living in the eastern US. And a practice was described in a film that I think was an award-winning film at that particular festival, where a practice from Scandinavia, where there was a similar conflict between reintroduced predators and agricultural livestock, that, as I recall it, simply involved discovering that both wolves and livestock were basically freaked out by a practice in Scandinavia of suspending colorful plastic strips from a wire fence that neither wanted to cross. And so I think data was compellingly presented that showed that both animals didn't want to meet each other anymore as a result of this very inexpensive, unobtrusive, and non-conflicting with other wildlife, I would imagine. So, I guess that's an example of trying to bring, exemplars of practice from other cultures, countries that may, in fact, not have been known, but when discovered, could be powerfully a solution to a new problem. I just wondered if you'd heard about that and whether you have any comment on that, please.
Yes, I do. It's actually got a name. It's called, bizarrely, fladry. Fladry, fladry. So it's a line of wire with colored little flags hanging off it, and you're dead right. Fladry worked remarkably well on wolves in the United States initially, but over time they habituated to it, and now fladry, yeah. And this is it's the perennial challenge of any mitigation that you come up with. And fladry's been tried by our farmers for jackal. And initially it works. You'll see when you drive through the Karoo next time, just look on some fences and you'll see plastic bottles. You'll see things hanging on the fences, and that was their attempt to use the fladry idea. But the jackals quite quickly worked out that, if there's no real cost, they will overcome it. And it's interesting that you raise the wolves, because I don't know how many people know this, but American conservation areas don't have fences. It's not in their ethos. So they typically have a core protected area and then a buffer area, and then you get into the farmlands. And in that buffer area, they issue permits to people to hunt. And so their way, as animals leak out of the core, so as the wildlife populations in the core go into that buffer area, then they set a quota, including for wolves, of hunting permits, and you can go and you can shoot elk, wolves. So you can get a permit to do this, which is, it's slightly anathema to us. I don't know similarly, in Germany, first world Germany, you get a hunting permit and you can go and shoot boar. So that's their equivalent of an omnivore. Baboon and a boar are very similar generalist species. So they can go and shoot the boar and eat the boar. So you can eat the boar. I mean, imagine that concept being applied in this Cape Town. We would never accept that, and yet it's acceptable in Germany, and the hunting is acceptable in the United States, and in fact in the Nordic countries.
So did the Scandinavian example find a B plan, or has it been abandoned? There's been no better new plan? I just was curious. Is there something?
Yeah, I know that there's been active hunting of predators and to protect the reindeer. So so once again, very much like the wolves, the elk in Yellowstone, the elk were being predated on, and they changed the behavior of the elk, and that had cascading effects. But yes, in both instances, there's now lethal management on wolves, which is.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emlyn. Thanks, Justin. Warren, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. A fascinating presentation, and I absolutely love the science. And I do sympathize. I've had the honor of sitting in on some of those baboon meetings in Cape Town about 7-8 years ago, so I know what you're up against. And one of the things that you raised, which I think is incredibly valid, not only for human-wildlife conflict, but I'm more involved in the invasive species side. And when you see someone like City of Cape Town dropping the ball on this, what happens is the next time you eventually, after 3 or 4 years, get everything up and running again, you almost have to start right from the very beginning, because you now have a whole new team of city managers, you have new representatives from NSPCA. And I found in the years that I've been involved in conservation is that legacy, we don't seem to be good at passing that baton forward and letting people know what was done and the success stories. As you mentioned, very poor communication. Have you got any ideas as to how we remedy that? Because I've seen this repeat over and over and over.
Warren, that is like balm to my soul, because that is exactly what has happened. I mean, the fact that you've experienced that means a lot to me. And you're going to have to give me some of the details on this, because I thought we were just uniquely unlucky. First of all, we lost the NSPCA legacy. So they turned around from a tool that they had approved, held a workshop on, and said we need to go this way, to being challenged with cruelty, the City of Cape Town, from exactly the same organism for using the tool that the previous people had approved. I mean, it's almost laughable, but it's not, because it resulted in a moratorium of the use of paintball guns, 6 weeks of no use, a massive spike in the death of baboons. And you know what? We will never recover that ground, as you said. And now we've got this new JTT, and suddenly we got a new, because staff turnover, new Sandparks person, no experience in baboons, new Cape Nature, and through no fault of their own. Why should they have experience with baboons? Coming into Cape Town and understanding this history it's 25 years of history of adaptive management. So all we've been doing, I've been spending an inordinate amount of my personal time, and my colleagues have, trying to re-educate the new. And it's a strange situation now where members of the public, civic organizations, know more than the authorities mandated to do this, to manage this challenge. And that's where we find. So thank you. Thank you very much for identifying a genuine challenge. And I don't have the answer. So if anyone else knows how to pass the baton better, yeah, I'd love to know.
Do you want to ask your question? Go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, Justin. I just want to say, very good talk. It was really great to see how passionate you are about this as well, to see it in the way that you speak to us. And I'm assuming that you bring that to any conversation that you have on this subject. My question is kind of similar to the previous one. I am starting out in wildlife now, and so a lot of my work does require at points to communicate to people, maybe just to the general public as a way of educating them, but also, like you said, stakeholders. And I was wondering if maybe you have some tricks of the trade, certain things to look into or to be aware of when going into this trade, to be a little bit more successful when communicating between stakeholders.
Yeah, so in my experience, the worst thing you can do when you're having a stakeholder engagement, and it's very common, it's often treated as a tick box exercise, is that you go along and you present, like I presented tonight, but you don't engage deeply afterwards. Now, if I really want to understand something or improve something, get a better guideline, get a better standard operating procedure, don't do a talk. Don't do you need a little bit of basic background, but get into a workshop. And at that workshop, make sure you have an extraordinarily good facilitator. That's key. That is absolutely paramount. You need someone, because we're not good people. We dig in, we're not very good at compromising. We've got to let go of pet theories. So you need someone who can take you there and literally hold your hand and take you there. And the best scenario is a workshop with a fantastic mediator to help us, to unlock us, to bring us closer together. And I've seen it done. It's currently happening in Simonstown. There's a group of people there who are doing this, and it's remarkable. how much better the stakeholder engagement, you can bring the two extremes closer to the middle, and that's really important. So that's what I would advise you. Don't do it. That government has to do stakeholder engagement, but when it becomes a tick box thing, it doesn't work. Get into a room, make sure the room is the right kind of space, and start off softly, and have a couple of things you can agree on, and start off by identifying your value differences. Don't be scared of saying at the beginning, my values are, I think that humans have dominion over animals, and therefore I accept that sometimes humans make decisions that will impact negatively on animal. And someone else will say, well, I believe that animals have equal rights. I believe that, and so you identify where you're coming from, and then that facilitator has to keep your dialogue respectful, with those engagements. So I've been in terrible workshops where there's been no facilitator and just egos everywhere, and then brilliant ones. And it comes down to that person. So find that person, find that facilitator, and they are gold.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Tawani. Pleasure to have you here. There's a question from Ben Cousins, and then I'm going to move to the chat room because there's a lot of comments coming in on the chat room. So Ben, help yourself. Go for it.
Thanks, Justin. Great talk as always. So what we have I'm from Simonstown, by the way. What we have in the South Peninsula is a situation where there's a great deal of disagreement amongst people, but there are also differences between areas. What people like Justin are saying to us is that we should move to baboon-proof electric fencing, but there will be some areas where it's not possible to erect those fences. But the problem being that in those very same areas, there are troops of baboons who are highly habituated to coming into urban areas. So if fences are not available and rangers using aversive conditioning techniques are not doing the job, it seems like adaptive management requires some fine-tuning to the particularities of particular locations around the South Peninsula. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about what those might be and what the resource implications, in other words, the funding implications of that might be. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, so I think every area can have a section of baboon-proof fencing, and the idea behind that is that so not all areas will be amenable to a substantive fence, but put them up in every area where the land allows it, because that simply now allows your rangers to be more effective. So let's start with that, and then we get into this really difficult space of well, how are we going to adapt the toolbox? Where are the new tools coming from? So we've heard of, and I haven't mentioned it, but because it's still being developed, but we've heard of virtual fences. We now have, I know the people who developed this are developing a fully automated virtual fence where a baboon member will wear a collar, which will talk directly to a series of boxes hidden in the landscape. And as the baboons come towards it, the collar sends a signal to the box, and the box then makes outrageous noises, including a gas bang. And the baboons don't know where it's coming from and react very strongly to it. So the idea is that we've got to keep adapting. We've got to keep innovating. We need engineers. We need people to innovate in this space. And always we need the welfare organizations to say, okay, that's fine. You're still within the realms of, it's still humane. And then I guess, Ben, we do know that at sometimes all of these efforts don't stop certain baboons. So you can put up a baboon-proof fence for 6 million rand, and one baboon might work it out. And so we have challenged people who have an animal rights perspective, saying, would it not be fair after that level of investment and with rangers guarding the entrances, if a baboon is prepared to run at a ranger, knock them to the ground, run over them and run into the suburb? What do you suggest we do with that baboon? And we've suggested perhaps it would be better to humanely put that baboon down. Would that not be an option? Absolutely not. Okay, well, what's the alternative? None was forthcoming. And that moves me to say, okay, if you are 100% opposed to lethal management at any level, then I'm going to ask you, at what point do we then take baboons to a sanctuary? So the bear that I spoke about that in Italy that killed a human, attacked another, that baboon was not allowed to be put down, and we may end up going there. We might have a court case like that in Cape Town, in which case, please, and I said it, the welfare organizations must fund and be funded for a sanctuary. And then we're going to have to put baboons in a sanctuary, and they'll have to retire in those areas if that non-lethal option comes. So it's a matter of, we've got to innovate, we've got to keep looking for novel methods to add to our toolbox, and then we need to have a solution. And if that can't be lethal, then it needs to be something like a sanctuary. And many people will be very opposed to that. And many people on this forum will be opposed to sanctuaries as a result of their personal experiences.
Thanks, Ben. Justin, there's a thank you from Mashudu Mukoka, who is from Lapalala, the wilderness school that Clive Walker started. He just says, great talk. Thank you so much. Very informative and thought-provoking. Then we have a comment from Michael Make Montana, who says, we have a similar problem in Wangi Town, Zimbabwe. How would one use a fence since they are coming from all directions?
Yes, so we have a Pringle Bay is on the just over the False Bay there, and they're also a circle, and baboons come in all directions, and so it's not always going to be. I still think a fence should be tried in Pringle Bay, just to, you know, the baboons tend to come more or less from one main direction. You know, there'll be a river or there'll be a you know, some high-lying land. There's usually, and you've got to, when they get into town, then they're spread out. So you have to find out where their sleeping site is, and you can put a fence there and channel them a little bit. I don't know. Each place is unique. I'd need to see what that looks like. Wangi, you need to find out what their main sources of food are, and then you should try ranges. You should try ranges with without paintball guns initially. It depends on the level of habituation of the baboons, but you always start with the least that you think you need, and then you escalate. And you might need to run a program similar to the city of Cape Town, because we know it works. And hopefully your politicians will be stronger than ours, and they will be able to resist people who say that the program's bad when all the evidence is contrary to that. So sorry, I would, you know, I think each place is absolutely unique, and you'd need to look at it. But there is a sort of toolbox approach to addressing these issues.
So on that note, Penelope Brown says, very well said and explained, Justin. Thank you. I do hope that city officials and politicians are required to watch this presentation and use it to inform their responsibilities regarding management.
Yes, thank you, Penny. And that's why I agreed to this talk that Kirsten asked me at short notice, and I thought, well, you know what, we're in that space now where we have to talk as much as we can. It's, you know, we had a very interesting discussion with my master's conservation biology group today about how bad scientists are at communicating. We publish our peer-reviewed literature, and it's because we get rewarded for that. They're very poor rewards for taking your science out into either the, you know, popular literature or doing talks like this. So it's important that we get our word out, and then Penny, you're right. We need the authorities to talk, and I have given this talk to the authorities. You know, so we are engaging at that level too. But we need the public to be informed, and we need other stakeholders to be informed, so that we can counter the other narratives that are pushed on social media, which are often not constructive.
Justin from Katie Williams, have similar management successes and challenges prevailed further along the coast, for example, Pringle Bay, Betty's Bay, Hermanus, or have those areas had a different story?
Yeah, they've been racked with a similar level of conflict between the people. I think almost even worse than Cape Town. And they have a service provider, and the service provider just simply couldn't operate in some of the areas because of the vitriol from the public, because they were so used to the baboons not being managed that when the baboons were first being managed, they really objected to the idea of the baboons being kept in Fynbos, because they quite liked them coming into the urban areas. It's a real challenge. So currently Pringle Bay has got their own version of something, but they're stuck. The Overstrand municipality is going to try. And then in Hermanus, there's a professional service provider. And that professional service provider is doing an incredible job. I mean, you can speak to people before and after who are living, and that system there is a virtual fence. That's where they're pioneering it. And we've seen the GPS data of the troops, and it's remarkable how successful they are being. So it's very difficult to, so the lobby groups got to the mayor of the Overstrand, in my opinion, and she imposed a moratorium on any lethal management or any removal of baboons. So that the worst behaved baboons were killed. One was shot in someone's house. Another one just disappeared. So, you know, that's what happens when you don't manage. The worst things happen. And then the communities get riven between, you know, a lot of people retire there, don't have a lot of disposable income. And, you know, when baboons jump on your car and cause 50 to 60,000 rands worth of damage, it's a problem. You don't want it. So you need a separation, and then you need the vehicle for separating the baboons from the urban space. And they haven't quite got it right. But it's as a biologist, it's fascinating because you've got this one section of the Overstrand which is doing something, and the other that's not. And the one that's not is in real pickle right now. And interestingly, last little anecdote, Kirsten, one village, Royals, has decided to share their space with baboons. So no management. And what do baboons do when you give them untrammeled access to urban areas? They come every day. 60, 70% of every day in town. Sounds fantastic. Great baboon proofing, but they're there for the garden and the fynbos and the, it's not about human food. They just love to forage low. So it's kind of a nice gift, except when you look at the mortality data. Between 70 and 80% of all deaths are human related, even in a place that wants to share their space. So it's a trap. It's a trap for the baboons. It's lovely for the community. It seems to be lovely for the baboons. And it's mostly them dying on the roads. To cross into that village, you cross a road, and they get killed on the roads. So infant mortality through the roof. We've got to think very carefully about that. Coexistence at what price?
Emlyn, you've been very patient. Can I come back to you?
Thank you very much, Kirsten. This is, Justin, a reference to what you were saying a couple of questions ago about scientists in the main being poor public communicators. And I'm just going to read a sentence in a paper I just wrote in the Geoethics Journal on the Anthropocene, which I'm happy to send you. But in a section called Approaches for Progress, where public and research needs to have a better marriage of intentions and knowledge, there is, as you may know, on this call amongst the audience, there's an outfit both in the US and a new subsidiary in the UK called the Frameworks Institute, which is focused on how do you go about changing attitudes and behavior. This is mostly on social challenges, but I think the methodology is applicable arguably to environmental challenges. And so this one sentence I will read, and I'm happy to say more about it. I say, overall, anthropological psychology, which is a field I hadn't really heard of, finds that the best way for the public to grasp science and society challenges is learning what science has discovered, why it matters, and what remains to be learned, rather than attempts at persuasion with science says fill in the blank styled exhortations. It sounds remarkably straightforward, but those three questions of what do we know, why does it matter, and what would make a difference, it seems to me to be sort of a straightforward structure to have an organized dialogue. You can't race to the end and say, what do we do, without knowing what the problem is and what do we know and why does it matter. So I think the what do we know, why does it matter, necessarily precede the solution side of the conversation. So I just put that out there. I'm happy to send you the reference if we can get in touch afterwards, Justin.
Yes, that'd be great. And you're dead right. When we start off on these things, before there was scientific data involved in this conflict, everyone had an opinion, and it's very difficult to counter because opinions are as diverse as the people presenting them. There's just everyone's got one, but data is different. If you go out there and find out what you don't know, so you say, we went to the authorities and said, what do you need to know in order to start moving ahead on this thing? And they said, well, we need to know this, this, and this. So we said, fine, we'll go and find out how many there are. We'll go and find out what's killing them. and we'll tell you about the sex ratio. That's exactly it. It's when that data came through, then suddenly the management started to be informed, and that led to better solutions. And you're right. In the absence of that, and in the absence of a process that would deliver that knowledge, we would never have got to a situation where you could make informed decisions. And yet, the whole thing got unpicked on social media. You know, just showing that we thought that the scientific support or the scientific foundations would be strong enough for the authorities to make. And I do think they can rationally argue in a court of law that everything they've done makes sense because it's underpinned by rational thinking and there's data to fall back on. And yet politicians proved to be the undoing.
Thank you.
But please do send that link to me
I'll
if you
get your
could.
email address from
Thank you.
headquarters. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Emlyn. A question from Derek Nabala. He says, in his area in the Mara, awareness has been of help to some extent. Incentives is something else, but not easy because there is no equivalent compensation, especially on food crops attacks. Human-wildlife conflict has never been easy. What are the better viable solutions? I think you have answered that for a long way, but maybe there's something you want to add.
No, I mean, I'm aware of the compensation argument. Compensation can be very important for building tolerance. So, you know, if you lose a livestock and it affects your livelihood and you get compensated for that, I think the compensation is always got to be subject to what effort did you put in to mitigate or to prevent the impact in the first place. So you can't just give a farmer, you know, endless financial reprieve if they're not trying to prevent the elephant from coming in or the hyena from getting their livestock. You've got to be trying to mitigate. So the farmer's got a responsibility to try and prevent it, to learn about the behavior and build a boma or a kraal. And then if they've done that, then the reward is a good way of building tolerance. But all reward schemes are subject to corruption and misuse and misclaims and what have you. So it's very difficult to do. But I think it's part of the equation. I think it really is part of the equation. It's worked very well in India. It's working in Namibia on the conservation, based, in their conservation communities up there. So it's got a place. I always think, and I think Emlyn said it. We got to know what we're dealing with. So you start off every conservation conflict by trying to find out what the drivers of that conflict are, and before you then move into the cycle of mitigation. And compensation is one attribute of that.
There's a comment from Pat Redford saying the reality is that if a gap in successful management occurs, the habituation process starts all over again, and all that history and effort and success falls away.
I think that's very much aligned with what Warren said.
Yes.
And Warren was talking about the loss of institutional knowledge as well, but Pat, 100%, how far you go back. And the funny thing is that we think about baboon behavior in a negative sense as a ratchet. Once they've learned to remove a sliding door or remove tiles to get into a house, or some extraordinary behaviors. They're amazing. If we could just stop and say how remarkable it is that they can do this, the innovation. I wish we could spend more time just saying, well done, guys, that was remarkable. But get someone's house. They've got children in there. In fact, there's some terribly difficult stories of children being deeply traumatized because they don't understand a big, hairy, toothed animal in their private living space, in their bedroom or what have you. Anyway, so we need solutions. And what we learned when there was a moratorium on the paintball use, in those 6 weeks, the behaviors learned that the rangers weren't scary again. And those rangers never really recovered that land. That psychological space. The baboons got a dominance over them. And now without the guidelines being used, we're seeing, the baboons living permanently in town, sleeping on buildings, just, sleeping inside Navy buildings. Just, it's all falls apart. And you'll never get that back. So Pat, you're 100% right. If you lapse, you lose.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Justin. Robert Labise says, thanks for a very informative presentation. What impact will introduction of fences have on the ecological processes, especially in the low grounds?
But as I said before, that fence is sitting right on the urban edge. In fact, it's sitting on the fire break in most places. So there's a fence, and there's 10 meters, and then there's a house with a vibrocrite wall and a pool and a garden so there's a tiny piece of land which, you know, I guess is sacrificed. But so I don't think, I think below the fence it's just urban. You're not going to build a fence where there's no, unless it's urban, because that's what you're trying to prevent the baboons going in there. So if there's a green belt, I don't think there'll be a fence there. So there'll be that sort of corridor, and the rangers will have to protect that. So no, I don't think too much, unless you're talking about fences going into the ground. And I guess, you know, the porcupines don't like the fences. They try and dig underneath them. So we designed, you know, a tunnel with a little U-bend in it, because the baboons will go in it otherwise. And the baboons can now get out of suburban areas. But we don't want them going in either, because when baboons go into urban areas, they get exposed to slugum pellets and the other stuff we liberally throw all over our garden to keep it looking a certain way. So I think it's okay. I don't think the fences will impact.
Justin, this looks like somebody you might know. So from Ruth Vaughan, she says, hi, Justin from Kenya, Ruthless and John Vaughan, who you stayed with about 30 years ago. Brilliant talk. Mange and baboons, if you reduce their range, A, they may not have access to diatomaceous dust baths that get rid of parasites, and B, reducing the range can cause micro mineral deficiencies that are easily remedied once diagnosed with salt licks. This would be my experience with giraffes in Naivasha.
Yeah, a very interesting point. Hi, Ruth. And so the idea of salt licks has come up in many contexts with a missing mineral or missing something that, you know, the baboons might be getting. But you need to, in this context, when I showed that one graph of where the baboons are and how much land there is, there's nothing stopping any of our baboons from really trekking, going huge distances, going to the coast, picking up. So they've got access to incredible amounts of natural land. They're just choosing not to use it. They can trek over the mountain. They can go to the coast on the other side. So I'll give you an example. We've got Takai Constantia. Sorry for those people out of country who don't know Cape Town, but it's one side, and then there's a giant mountain, and then there's another side. They never go over the mountain. There's nothing stopping them. It's just, and if you go over the mountain, you get onto granitic soils with limpets and mussels, and we know baboons marine forage, and they could be accessing a plethora of new fynbos and trees, and they're just not going. So the interesting thing about the one troop with mange is that they live almost permanently in the urban space. They have very high stress levels. And one thing we know about mange and wildlife is that when you are high stress, you get immunocompromised, and then you become vulnerable to almost everything. And mange is one of the first things that pops up. So amazing research on bobcats in the United States, and these naked bobcats popping up. And one of our postdocs who studied that showed that these bobcats have been exposed to rodenticides. The rodenticides compromised their immune system. The immune system expressed itself as alopecia, loss of hair. And that compromised their thermoregulatory ability and of course, their lives. So yeah, we don't know what it is, but I'm almost certainly linked to coming into urban space and choosing not to go into natural.
Justin, Dr. Cheryl Ogilvie from TUT, she says, excellent talk, thank you. Education. Have you gone out to educate all different target groups from young to old, interlink into school programs, making a difference, start young, interpretive walks, or a little too dangerous? More research, as you said, we need engineers. Time to think out of the box. One of my ex-students tracked the baboons for years, Siglinda Road, and she really shared her love for baboons, and this is what we need. Sadly, she passed away. Would you like to comment to that, Justin?
Yeah, I'd like to just, as Ziggy, as we called her, Siglinda Road, Ziggy was remarkable. She made an incredible difference to the peninsula, because she loved the baboons, and yet she was one of the first people to say this baboon should be put down for its own sake, for its welfare. So Ziggy, because because everyone knew she cared so deeply for them. When she said that, she provided people trusted her, and therefore you knew she was saying that because she cared. And that was so important, because the right decision was being made for the individual. And some people say that you should never do that, but actually, you know, if you're going to prevent suffering, I think it's probably a better thing. Anyway, schools. We did many school talks at one stage. I think we probably did too many. We did 20 in a year, and we got a bit of burnout. It's very hard on the postgraduates. And yet when I was talking to my conservation biology class saying, you know, what are we doing wrong and where are we going right? And they said, you know, the stakeholders that engage with you on this are mostly elderly people. And I said, well, that's because you have to be quite rich to own a property along the edge of Table Mountain. But they said, but you must talk to the young people, because the young people get it. They'll innovate this. They'll show you how to do TikTok videos, and they're going to turn this thing on its head and get the message out there. And I listened, and I think they're right. I think we need to learn a lot about communication from the youth, and we need to get into their heads. And because they say, I like to think that I still am open to other ideas. They say older people aren't, and the young people are. So you need to spend more time with young people, because you can change their minds easier. They're more open. So yes, Cheryl, thank you for those points. We have done, I think we've done an enormous number of public talks, but maybe we need to pick up the schools again. And just as a quick aside, there's a group of social scientists currently running a theatre, Empatheatre. They're doing plays. I saw someone made a comment about art. Art is essential, be it a picture, a sculpture, or a play, to change the way people think about things and their relationship with animals. So I really do think there's so much we can do.
Thanks, Justin. I think that answers Carol Preston's comments. I see there's a raised hand by James Danoff-Berg. James, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, please. Thank you, Kristen. Just a really great talk, really interesting things, such a unique challenge that you face, and really great solutions for getting to it. I wanted to sort of pipe in and suggest a difference of terms. Rather than education, which is what we in conservation biology especially tend to ascribe what we're doing to, right, is that it's education. We're teaching people about baboons, how to live sustainably with baboons, how to minimize conflict, all of that. And there's ample literature. I'm a social scientist. There's ample literature to support the idea that that education does not change behavior, right? Education increases awareness, could improve empathy, but it doesn't lead to behavior change, right? And that really what we in conservation should be doing is therefore not education. It should be education that serves the purpose of behavior change, you know? And that's really what you're trying to do with a lot of your work. You could maybe expand it a bit by saying things like, this is what you need to do, you know, this is the purpose of this program, this education program, this engagement program, that we need to be able to live more sustainably, and these are the ways to do it, you know. And in conservation, I find the dialogue, because it's mostly biologists rather than social scientists, is very much focused on that education component, when really what we need to be doing is behavior change. You know, I don't care if people learn, really. As a conservationist, I want people to change their behavior, you know, and that's really what your goal is, if I understand correctly. I wonder if you wouldn't mind commenting on that perspective.
I wish. Okay, so that's like that's right up there on my wish list. I just don't have the skills. I don't have the skill set to do it. So if social scientists, that's why I said the social scientists are coming on board now. They're doing plays to try and, I guess, change the way people think about it. I mean, changing behavior, perhaps you can explain a little bit better to me. And give me an example. How would you go about changing someone's behavior if, for example, they say the following: I think baboons should come into urban areas because they were here first, and I like to see them on a daily basis. Yeah, and then I've got the scientific data of, well, hold on, if that happens, then they're going to suffer, because I know what's going to get them ultimately. So how do we give me your social science perspective on that little scenario?
Sure. Well, you know, one of the major motivators for people to resist behavior change is a loss, a sense of what we call a frame of loss. And if loving baboons, having baboons nearby, and not having them for that person, which is a challenge. We have a similar thing here with ravens. People feed ravens in huge numbers, and they go out and they kill all of our desert tortoises in Southern California. So they want to see the ravens because it's a great thing. They want to see the baboons because it's an interesting action. I don't want to take more of your time here, but I would say probably, you know, the best thing to do is to play on their empathy for the baboons. They clearly have a lot of love and care for the baboons, for the species, right? But say that your efforts, your data have demonstrated very clearly that their presence in urban areas is bad for them. You know, and here's an easy way to be able to see them out in the wild. Go to this location. It's a guaranteed sighting of baboons, you know. So you try to mitigate the loss frame, right, by bridging to another behavior that will help them continue to live their love of baboons, right, their empathy for them, but understand that by feeding them or whatever it is that they're doing to encourage them is bad for the animals, bad for the system, bad for the people. One possible approach. I know your system as well as you, of course.
Sure. So it's a bit of both then, understanding your system and then, but I think that's where we're at. I think, you know, if there are any students on this forum right now, I think what you've just said and the importance of the social side, I think it's the missing part of this whole puzzle. I'm so glad the Swedish people are here, and I'm so glad people like you, social scientists, we can't have enough of it because that's where it is. Someone said right at the beginning, I think it was in the introduction, that, you know, conservation is mostly about people. And it's the part we understand the least right now. So thank you. Yes.
Thank you, James. I see that Pat has raised her hand. I know that she's given quite a few comments on in the chat. Pat, please go ahead and ask your question. Pat. Okay, I think I'm going to move on to Penelope Brown. Penelope, would you like to ask your question? Just unmute yourself. Yeah, there we go.
Right, done.
Perfect.
You know, I found this last little discussion very interesting, Justin, because basically my perspective on this issue of what we call baboon huggers preventing proper management, and going out and sitting with the baboons and fraternizing with them, that sort of behavior often causes more problems than not doing it, because the baboons become adapted to people, and then they eventually get killed because of them. So I believe that those sort of people cause more deaths of baboons than the people who chase them away, put it that way. So I think that social aspect is very important. People don't understand the negative impacts that they are imposing on the baboons, who should be wild animals. They're not supposed to be in the urban areas. So thank you. I've forgotten the guy, James, I think it was, for that comment and your response.
Yes, and if I could just add to that, when, you know, people don't like me saying this, but it's just a fact. When Shirley Strum, who's a primatologist who's dedicated her life to understanding baboons, came here, she looked at the scenario, she spoke to all the actors, she spoke to the stakeholders, and she turned around at one stage and said, but to, you know, to animal rights group people, she said, don't you see that you're potentially loving these baboons to death? She actually used those words, and, you know, that's not easy to use those words, but coming from her, it was very powerful, because she clearly loves baboons, but she considered the peninsula baboons to be atrociously behaved. And in fact, her recommendation was extraordinarily harsh. It was at that outset in 2012, I think you need to get rid of all the very habituated baboons and accept that you all dropped the ball a long time ago, start afresh with wild baboons and keep them wild. You know, that was her proposal. And we said, well, hold on, Shirley, but maybe we should try the deterrence first. let's try the non-lethal net and see how far we go there. And now we've got to the stage of trying the fences to see if we can go there. Yeah, I do believe that those people who actively go out of their way to habituate baboons and become their friends, it's a great disservice to the baboons. It really is. You know, if you really respect the animal, you'll keep them wild. I like the idea of, you know, we're lucky, and you walk in the mountains all the time, Penny. When you come across baboons, you see them. The best thing is they see you and they're wary of you and they stay away. That's what you want. That's sort of, we are scary. We're a very dangerous species. And so that sort of natural fear of humans, or, you know, other species respecting each other's space is important. It's part of the way things evolved and adapted.
Thanks, Justin. Penelope, I hope that answers your thoughts. I think, Justin, that I think we can actually give you a break now, because the questions are slowing down and the rest of the comments are just thank yous and great speech, great talk comments. And if there is anything that I've missed out, then Marette will send it to you. See, there's applause from James. So thank you so much for the time that you've given us. It's been really, yeah, very insightful, and yeah, I really appreciate it very much. I think our audience has already appreciates it too. Marette, you've got your hand raised.
Hi, Kirsten. Sorry to bother. Bev Stevens just sent a question. She actually, excuse me, she accidentally sent it to me privately.
Okay.
May I quickly read it out?
Please go ahead.
Okay, so she says, do you think once there are no ranges, etc., that they will spread further into the urban areas, like into Fischhoek, Noordhoek, etc.?
Yes, I do, without a shadow of doubt. If you know, we've seen it, and I'll give you an example. The sort of challenge you face as a biologist. We heard that the rangers were going to go on strike in 2009, and the missing part of the puzzle was we didn't have good before and after data. It's hard to do experimental type research on wildlife systems. You don't have controls, you don't get replicates. So the best you get is before and after. So we heard they're going to go on a strike. How long is the strike going to be? We don't know. Scramble, get a student out there, train them up, let them follow the baboons. 10 days, the strike lasted. So for 10 days, we got, what do baboons do when there's nothing and they're used to ranges? You know what they did? They woke up that morning, they looked around, there were no rangers. They came down from the tree, still no rangers, and they made a straight line to the nearest suburb, Komaki, which had big gardens, and they're not allowed to go to. They kept way away from there. They kept near a place called Ocean View, which has got very hard edges because it's hard for a baboon to go in there. It's a legacy of apartheid South Africa. It's a township with dogs free ranging and tiny properties, and you know, and not big gardens. The baboons just went straight past the township, straight into the affluent suburb, and there they spent 10 days. And it was absolute chaos, unmitigated chaos. So we've seen, and then the rangers came back to work, and it was so difficult for them to get the baboons out of that area again and back to where they were. And now the baboons have got that memory, and every time there's a sort of lapse in the management, or something happens, maybe a terrible rainfall event, or there's a strike, or the rangers get sick from COVID, straight back. They never unlearned that. So this is the danger. On the 1st of January 25, when there's no program, peak tourist season, if there's not a transition plan in place, we're in a heap of trouble. And those communities are in a heap of trouble. So I don't believe the authorities will do that. I don't know what's going on. I don't know what game's being played, but it needs to stop. They need to tell us what the transition plan is before they get their fences up.
Justin, oh wait, we've got a question from Johan, and then I'm going to go to the last comment from James again. Johan?
I would just like to thank Justin for this kind of talk, and such an example of how you allow science to speak for itself, but also with empathy to the community and the people surrounding the area where the baboons live. So really thank you for being such an example. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then Justin James Danoff-Berg, again, he says, great stuff, Justin. I really enjoyed your presentation and the challenges that you are so deftly addressing. There's always challenges, but successes should be celebrated as well. So thank you.
Yep. And Kirsten,
Super.
just from my perspective, thank you for the platform. I didn't realize what an incredibly broad reach you've got. You've connected me with friends from my undergraduate days who popped up. And so yeah, your organization's obviously doing a great job in terms of what we need to do, which is to share our findings with a broader base of people. So thank you.
Thanks, Justin. You're always welcome. Okay. Stay well, everybody. Have a great evening. And thank you so much.